Welcome to The Explainer. Let's just dive right into this because today we are looking at a figure who, well, he often slips right through the cracks of your typical history class. But honestly, he absolutely shouldn't. We're talking about Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd President of the United States. And we aren't just going to look at him as some forgotten face on a dusty old portrait. No, we're going to see him as a genuinely pivotal leader, a guy who essentially built a bridge straight from the Gilded Age right into the modern American era. To really understand where Harrison's head was at, you just have to listen to his own words. I do not mistrust the future. And what makes this incredibly special is that Benjamin Harrison's voice is actually the very first preserved audio recording of anyone in the White House. Just think about that for a second. The time of that recording was this crazy, curious mix of two completely different eras, how things used to be done and how they were going to be done moving forward. Harrison was deeply aware of this massive transformation happening across America, and that quote perfectly captures his forward-looking mindset as he prepared to step onto the world stage. Section 1. A president at the crossroads, between the smoke-filled rooms of the past and a surging future. So Harrison was a man with a foot firmly planted in two very different worlds. On one hand, he had to navigate the gritty, famously corrupt reality of late 19th century party bosses. A time when politics was basically considered a contact sport. But on the inside, this quiet fire was always burning. Let's look at exactly where that inner fire for justice actually started. Picture this. It's 1833. Harrison is just a boy, pressing through an alder thicket on his family's farm, when he suddenly stumbles upon a frightened fugitive slave trying to eat some walnuts. The man gives young Benjamin this fierce, startled look, absolutely terrified the boy is going to turn him in. Harrison was pretty spooked himself and ran off, but he kept the man's secret. It was just a single, vivid childhood encounter, but it quietly ignited a lifelong dedication to civil rights that would go on to define his entire political career. Section 2. Out of the grandfather's shadow, forging an independent path through war and law.
You see, Harrison had a massive shadow looming over him. His grandfather was William Henry Harrison, the legendary battlefield commander at Tippecanoe, and of course, the 9th President of the United States. But Benjamin was absolutely determined to escape that shadow. He wanted to succeed entirely on his own merits, and he built up a ton of grit early on. In 1854, he and his new wife Caroline packed up literally everything they owned into a single box and moved to Indianapolis with exactly 91 cents to their name. And when the Civil War broke out, he didn't just stay safely tucked away in his law office, he led the 70th Indiana Regiment, displaying completely fearless leadership under some really devastating fire at Peachtree Creek. That actually earned him a nomination for Brigadier General. After the war, he built this rock-solid reputation as a brilliant, cool-headed lawyer. He most notably shredded the alibis in a sensational loan-sharking murder case known as the Nancy Clem trial.
But it's worth remembering that life in the Gilded Age was undeniably dark. In 1878, Harrison's father passed away, and at the time, grave robbing, specifically for medical cadavers, was a very, very real problem. Even though they hired a watchman, things went wrong. An investigation led Harrison's brother to the Ohio Medical College, where he discovered a hooded body hanging from a rope beneath a trapdoor. When the hood came off, it was their recently deceased father. The source material notes that, upon hearing this horrifying news, it was possibly the only recorded time the deeply pious Benjamin Harrison ever uttered a profanity. Despite these incredibly heavy personal tragedies, Harrison's resilience just made his popularity soar. Rather than relying on the undignified, exhausting nature of old political barnstorming across the country, he innovated. He ran what was called a front porch campaign. Literally, he managed to bring over 300,000 voters in specific interest groups right to his own home in Indianapolis. He'd stand there, speak to their specific issues, have a stenographer record it all, and then hand those notes straight to the wire services. He basically invented modern political marketing right there, from his front yard. This highly unique strategy led him straight to victory in the 1888 election against the incumbent Grover Cleveland. He won the Electoral College 238 to 168. Now, the duality of this moment is just fascinating. When Harrison won, he sincerely credited divine providence for the victory. But the political party bosses, they scoffed at that. Behind the scenes, they had used incredibly dirty backroom deals to secure those crucial swing states. This included a totally scandalous tactic of dividing swing voters in Indiana into quote-unquote blocks of 5 and just straight up paying them off. Harrison was so disgusted that he refused to speak to the orchestrators of those deals ever again. Section 3. The $1 Billion Congress. A tidal wave of transformative legislation. Once he actually got into the White House, Harrison completely refused to be a passive executive who just deferred to Congress. Not his style. He actively strong-armed lawmakers over lavish dinners of green turtle soup and roast duck, passionately persuading them to back his ambitious agenda. And looking impartially at the historical record, we can see just how sweeping this agenda was. The 1890 Pension Act created safety nets for Civil War veterans and their dependents, which was really a major precursor to the social safety nets we completely take for granted today. He signed the Sherman Antitrust Act to crack down on corporate monopolies, and he pushed through the McKean Tariff and the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, both of which sparked fierce, nationwide debates over trade, wages, and inflation. It wasn't just a few bills, it was a legislative tidal wave. But amidst all this massive economic legislation, one single question really defined his moral compass. When and under what conditions is the black man to have a free ballot? Harrison aggressively backed the Lodge Bill. This was a piece of legislation that sought to use federal authority to supervise elections and protect African American voting rights against the severe Southern backlash and voter suppression happening at the time. Now, while the bill ultimately failed in the Senate due to fierce opposition, it firmly positioned Harrison as a visionary executive, a president who actively used his platform to advocate for a multi-ethnic nation made up of equal citizens. Harrison was also quietly making moves that directly impact the American landscape you enjoy today. 30 million acres. Using a little provision he cleverly slipped into a Land Revision Act, he put over 30 million acres of forest under federal protection. This massive stroke of executive action is widely considered the critical precursor to our modern national forest system. And he was equally hyperactive on the international stage because his Secretary of State, James G. Blaine, was frequently absent due to quote-unquote illness, or let's be real, maybe just trying to avoid that brutal D.C. summer heat. Harrison basically ran foreign policy himself. He worked closely with his Navy Secretary to authorize the building of powerful battleships, completely transforming a depleted fleet into a true global force. And he wasn't afraid to use this new power, navigating a very tense standoff with Chile over the deaths of American sailors. He also negotiated trade deals all across Latin America and even issued the very first presidential order to protect a specific species, the seals of the Pribilov Islands. Section 4. The People's House, transforming the White House into a modern home. Now, we absolutely cannot talk about Benjamin without bringing in First Lady Caroline Harrison. Together, they had to navigate the chaotic and frankly fascinating reality of living in a Gilded Age White House. And the White House they inherited was definitely not some glamorous palace. It was a mess. The building was so badly infested that rats would literally climb up onto the dining tables and beds. Plus, Benjamin and Caroline were completely terrified of the newly installed electricity. They refused to even touch the light switches themselves out of fear of getting shocked. And because public access to the building was so unbelievably loose back then, the president himself once had to help guards physically tie up an intruder in the White House using a curtain cord. You really can't make this stuff up. But despite all the chaos, Caroline's influence was profoundly progressive. She brilliantly used her reputation to secure women's admission to Johns Hopkins Medical School. She was the very First Lady to give a public address and the first to host a public art exhibition. She also spearheaded a massive, desperately needed sanitation and beautification overhaul of the White House itself. Tragically, though, she contracted tuberculosis and passed away in the White House just weeks before the 1892 election, an election that a grieving Harrison ultimately lost to Grover Cleveland. Section 5. A Legacy Reconsidered, the Twilight of a Quiet Fighter. Defeated and widowed, Harrison returned to Indianapolis. But his story was far from over. He reinvigorated a highly successful law practice, eventually found love again, remarrying his late wife's niece, Mim, and just continued to show this almost superhuman endurance. I mean, he even represented Venezuela in a major border dispute in Paris, arguing in court for an astonishing 25 hours. And if you want a perfect, humanizing vignette of who Benjamin Harrison was to his very core, just picture this. He's in his late 60s taking an evening stroll in Indianapolis when a neighbor yells out that she had just been robbed. This former president of the United States literally sprints down the street, chases down the thieves, and single-handedly nabs one of the robbers himself. He was a man of action until the very end. He passed away from pneumonia in 1901. We're going to conclude today's explainer with Harrison's own words. He originally said this about Ulysses S. Grant, but it's incredibly fitting for himself. Great lives never go out, they go on. Benjamin Harrison was a truly transformative executive. He expanded the Navy, fought relentlessly for civil rights, preserved millions of acres of American land, and stood up to corrupt political bosses. And it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. If a leader does what is right, even when it isn't popular or politically easy, how should we truly measure their historical footprint? It's definitely something to think about the next time you hear the name Benjamin Harrison. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.